Welcome back to the Prado Museum. Thank you for joining us again for more of our weekly conversations in English, brought to you with the help of the American Friends of the Prado Museum. Today we'll be talking about Nicolas Poussin. Poussin was one of the great French artists of the 17th century, although he didn't spend much of his career in France. He spent most of it in Italy because he was enamored with classical culture, with ancient Greece and Rome, and so he moved to Italy, he moved to Rome, and he spent time there where he could study classical sculpture and be inspired by the painting of the Renaissance, especially Raphael. He also was privileged in that he was able to move around in a very exclusive elite circle of the highest level of writers and artists and scientists. And he really was able to do that with the help of his friend and patron, the poet, Giovanni Marino. So today we're going to see this painting by Poussin, Parnassus, painted between about 1631 and 1633, and see how he was inspired by the classical world, and also how he pays tribute to Raphael, and maybe also to his friend and patron, Marino. Now when we look at the painting, some of you might pick up immediately the reference to Raphael's Parnassus, which is right next to his School of Athens in the Raphael rooms of the Vatican Museum. Now, in the 17th century, there were really generally speaking, there were two major trends in art that coexisted at the same time, both Baroque and Classicism. Now, some artists, like Simone Vouet, another French artist that was in Rome around the same time, looked to the naturalism and the pronounced chiaroscuro of Caravaggio. And here we have a painting by Simone Vouet where you can see some of these qualities. While other artists, like Poussin, looked to artists of the Renaissance like Raphael and Classicism, and we see these balanced, harmonic compositions, ideal beauty, references to antiquity, elegant restraint, all of these things that make us think of the painting of Raphael and references to the classical world. Now, of course, most artists pulled a little bit from both, Poussin included, but he was more than anything, he was overwhelmingly a classicist. And being so, Raphael would really be an ultimate source of inspiration, hence this reinterpretation of Raphael's Parnassus. So what is happening here? What is the scene we're looking at? Well, this takes place on the Mount of Parnassus, which is a mountain in Greece that, according to tradition, was the site of the temple to the god Apollo. And it was also home to the Muses. Right next to Apollo's temple, there was a fountain, the Castalia fountain, which was the site of an important rite of purification and inspiration, specifically for poets. So these are the groups we can see here. We have Apollo, and next to him are the Muses. And then poets. We have poets on either side, with the fountain in the middle. So Apollo is here in the center, bare-chested, with the laurel wreath crown on his head. And he's presenting a cup to a poet. And in this cup there would be ambrosia. Ambrosia is the name of the food or the drink of the gods that provided immortality. And at the same time, the muse Calliope, the muse of poetry, of epic poetry, and of eloquence, is placing this laurel wreath crown on his head. Now, of course, the most celebrated epic poet is Homer, the ancient Greek author who's attributed with having written the Iliad and the Odyssey. So this could be a reference to Homer. And here we see he has two books, one he has in his hand, and the other one he's giving to Apollo. So the poet is giving the gods his works, and the gods are giving him a laurel wreath, a symbol of triumph and immortality. Now, if we think for a minute about how one can be immortal, I mean, we can think that, of course, one can be immortal being a god, having immortality and never dying. And another way to be immortal, especially for a poet, is to be remembered by posterity. And to be remembered, you have to be great. And to be great, you need to have inspiration. And that brings us back to the fountain of Castalia. The fountain is the source for inspiration. The water that comes from the fountain inspires the poets. It's the font of creativity. In the front, we can see that there are two putti, which is the name for these angel-like, these Cupid-like figures that are scooping up bowls of this water to give to the poets for their inspiration to pass around. And the nymph, Castalia, the woman that we have in the center, is the personification of the fountain. She's the embodiment of this source of inspiration and of creativity. And I don't think it's too much of a stretch to think about how Castalia, this beautiful woman, is a metaphor for these ideas of creativity, of creation, and of beauty in one single source. If we look at the muses for a minute, we'll see that they all have kind of a similar face, which is Poussin's ideal, but it's also because the muses are all sisters, but each of them have different attributes that they carry that help us to identify them. Let's see, right here we can see, well, we've already seen this is Calliope. This is the muse of epic poetry. She's the head of the muses. This is Terpsichore, and we can see she's a little bit more in motion than the rest of the muses. I think the rest are a little bit more static, and she looks like she's a little bit more dynamic, a little bit more fluid with the movement of her clothes, and even with the positioning of her feet. On this side, we have Thalia, who is the muse of comedy, and she has one half of the mask in her hand, while her counterpart, who's standing next to her, has the other half of the mask, tragedy, carrying the other half of the mask, and a dagger. Now, Poussin was an intellectual and a cultured person, like I said. He was friends with all of the most important intellectual and cultural circle in Rome, really thanks to his friend Marino, and he's even called a painter-philosopher. His paintings are often filled with metaphor, and they do have this quiet, pensive quality to them. They seem like they are profound and psychologically complex. So here we have a scene that is a celebration of the arts. It's really a scene of celebration, especially of poetry in Apollo's temple, and it's a celebration that is joyous, but it is still ceremonial and solemn. It tells us about the capacity of the arts to ennoble a person as well, and the opportunity to gain immortality through them. In the painting, we can see the classical and the mythological sources of inspiration for the poets personified in Castalia and in the muses. But at the same time, it seems like Poussin is simultaneously making a comment on his own sources, drawing directly on a composition by Raphael, which encompasses all of his personal interest in the classical world. And then, of course, we can't forget that this is a celebration of the arts, but it's specifically a celebration of poetry. And we have to remember that Poussin's friend, Marino, was a poet, and he was also his patron, making him a very important source for Poussin as well. So it could be that the poet in the middle might also be a reference to Giovanni Marino. And with that, we'll conclude our short session of English for today. And thank you for joining me. If you're interested in knowing a little bit more about the American Friends and the projects we do, maybe how you can get involved, you can find out more on our website. And thank you for joining, and we'll see you again next Wednesday.